As World War II came to an end, the civil rights movement was about to kick back into gear. Now, we had seen an earlier civil rights movement back in the early 20th century that had made a little bit of progress during the 19 teens and 1920s, but when the Great Depression hit, everyone on both sides of the issue were too busy trying to feed their families and survive to either push for civil rights or to resist. So, for the most part, the civil rights movement kind of goes on pause during the 1930s as we struggle through the Depression. And then as we move on into the 1940s, we're fighting World War II. And so people on both sides of the civil rights issue are fighting the Nazis, fighting to win the war. Now, World War II is going to help strengthen sentiment for the civil rights movement because during World War II, we see the Nazis persecuting Jews and other people across Europe, and this just strengthens the idea that racism is evil. It doesn't get that point across to everyone in America, but it does strengthen that position. Also, African Americans are going off and fighting for the United States in this war, and they're going to fight for other people's freedoms, other people's rights. And when they come back after having risked their lives to give others freedom, give others rights, they're ready to once again take up that cause for themselves. And so there's a new spirit reborn to push for civil rights after World War II. Now, in 1954, this is when things really start to kick into high gear. The first major event of the modern civil rights movement that we think of, well, actually, there's one more that I do want to mention before that. In the late 1940s, there's a significant event. We had seen back in the 1920s the Harlem Renaissance with literature and art and music make cracks in the wall dividing races. And we do see that again in the 1940s when Jackie Robinson becomes the first black man in a very long time, ever since the color barrier had been established. He becomes the man who breaks the color barrier. He's going to play for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and although he is going to be resisted and face a lot of discrimination at first, he wins over his teammates. He's a great player. They could really do well with him on their team. Plus, when they see other teams starting to attack him, they start taking up for him. So even though his own team had initially resisted him, they eventually support him. And he wins fans. And other teams look at all these great players in the Negro Leagues that they could have on their team if they just get past this segregation. And so we see in baseball, again in just a popular area of society, cracks in this color barrier that are going to help move forward the progress of the civil rights movement. However, in legal terms, in 1954, the big break that comes along is the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Little Linda Brown, a little third grader in Topeka, Kansas, lived just a few blocks away from a school, but instead she was forced to walk several blocks to a bus stop and then take a bus across town to a black school because the town was segregated, the schools were segregated. So, in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education becomes a landmark case which is going to challenge the old concept of separate but equal that had been established in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which you remember studying earlier. And in this case, they could have argued, well, black schools, the textbooks are out of date, the schools are in bad repair, the heating and cooling systems don't exist, and so it's not equal. But that's not the case. That's not what the point of this case is. They want to argue that segregation can never be equal, that segregation must end. So the lawyers in this case, such as Thurgood Marshall here, he'll eventually be the first black Supreme Court justice, they make the argument that segregation itself is what is unequal. So they're not asking for better schools, they're asking for segregation in the schools to end. And one of the most memorable things that they do during this case is they bring little children, African American children. They put them on the stand. They show them two dolls, a white doll and a black doll. And they ask them, which is the good doll? And again they reply that the white doll is the good doll. And the point they were trying to make is that by being segregated, they're being given this message by society that they're not good enough, that they're not ever going to be equal. And this helps get this across. Ultimately, they win the case, which means now we're going to see at the on the national level, schools are going to be required, if they're public schools, to integrate. Now, this is going to take a long time for this to happen, and it doesn't force private schools to integrate. You're actually going to see some flight to private schools by some people who are trying to avoid segregation or integration. You're also going to see a lot of resistance in certain areas, and really the whole thing took not just months, not just years, really took decades. Even by the time I was in school in the 1970s, the idea of busing, it was no longer the race thing, it was just the busing was what they were saying, they were complaining about. But there was still resistance to integration all the way up into the 70s, really. But this makes it the law, and we're going to start to see change. Now, after this success, a year later, we like to think of some of the feel-good moments of the civil rights movement. You know, things like Martin Luther King Jr. giving a speech, Rosa Parks sitting on the bus and refusing to give up her seat. These are heroic moments. These are, to a certain degree, feel-good moments, even if they cause controversy at the time. But the story of Emmett Till is awful. It's heart-wrenching. It's the thing that people don't like to talk about, but it is significant. And this, you have to remember, this happens just a few months before Rosa Parks decides not to give up her seat. So it's not just, oh, we want rights. Oh, we've made a little bit of success here with schools, and now we want further rights. The violence and the harshness of segregation had not gone away, and it was still fresh in the minds of those who were fighting for civil rights. And so the story of Emmett Till was a 13-year-old kid in Chicago, and he went to an integrated school in the North. He was said to have had some white friends. However, when he was 13 years old, he wanted to see what it was really like down south, and he visited his uncle and cousins down in Mississippi, one of the most extremely segregated states that there is. And exactly what happened is still kind of controversial, but on a Sunday, he and a couple of his cousins, they went to this little store managed by a white couple. The woman was in the store, and when they purchased the candy that they were buying, he either whistled at her or made a comment which was a little too fresh. It could have been that he had a lisp and the whistle was not intentional. There's a lot of debate on both sides about exactly what happened, but the thing is, the woman later tells her husband that this young man had come on to her, possibly even assaulted her, and so the husband gets mad. He gets his brother-in-law. The two of them go that night to where Emmett Till is staying, and they take him by force. His family expects he's going to be back the next morning beaten really well. That's what they expect. But what ends up happening is they take this young man, 13-year-old kid, and they take him to several locations where he is beaten, tortured, but he's defiant. He is not going to just say, fine, you are superior, and he won't give in. And ultimately, it makes them so mad, they end up beating him to death in horrific ways. And then they take his body and they dump it in the river. When his body finally is found, it is so mutilated and so bloated that the local authorities won't even declare that it's him. They just say this could be anybody, and they won't press charges on these men who had killed him, who had kidnapped him. And his mother makes a heart-wrenching decision. She claims the body, and rather than just simply bury him, she decides to have an open casket funeral so that people can see the violence done against her son. And this makes national news, and people see the pictures, and it starts to draw attention across the country to the evils of segregation, to just how terrible it is down there when these men can get away with doing this to her son. And ultimately, that's going to put pressure on the local authorities to finally put these men on trial, where they will be found not guilty. And then after that, now having been tried, and no longer because of the Fifth Amendment, where they cannot be tried twice for the same crime. Once they're found innocent of murdering him, then they go to a national publication when they're interviewed, and they brag about how they killed him. But there's no way you can do anything about it now. And this is how bad it is, but it starts to stir up public support for civil rights. Of course, down south, you still have plenty of people who are afraid that civil rights is going to tear apart the fabric of society, and so they're adamantly resisting. So the tensions are just getting stronger. Now, in the midst of all that, a few months later, in December of 1955, you end up having what is, by comparison, a feel-good moment of the movement when Rosa Parks is told to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and she refuses. But this wasn't just a whim. She had been involved in the struggle for civil rights, and she was aware of all that was going on, and she made a decision. I am not going to give up this seat. I am going to, by sitting, take a stand right here. And her arrest sparks the Montgomery bus strike, where the African American community comes together and they start supporting each other and giving each other rides so that they can avoid using the buses. They were the primary users of these buses. And the bus company's really going to feel it when they stop using the buses, but they demand, we don't want segregation on the buses. We don't want to be forced to sit at the back of the bus anymore. And the organization there starts to gain national attention. Not only that, but it just happens to be the right place for a young pastor in the community. The churches actually help do a lot of this organizing. And this young pastor, a fellow by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., is one of the spokesmen for this bus strike. And this gives him a national platform where he becomes a leading figure of the movement. And throughout the movement, we're going to see Dr. King promote this type of resistance: peaceful protest, even civil disobedience, as we're going to see, where people will have sit-ins and they will defy these segregation laws because they're wrong. But they'll do it peacefully. And this is the way Martin Luther King Jr. is promoting resistance. So we're seeing resistance grow. Well, meanwhile, back on the front of school integration, in 1957, we have an incident in Little Rock, Arkansas, where, now realize this high school has more than 1,000 students. This is a big high school, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they decide it's going to be integrated with 9 teenage kids. Imagine the kind of pressure that we're putting on these 9 teenagers to go into this school and integrate it. And that means, the school's going to be hundreds of people who don't want them there, who openly are prejudiced, openly resist. And the day that they show up to integrate the school, well, a crowd has gathered. And angry parents and angry students are swearing at them and yelling at them. And Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas, he sends out the National Guard to block the way. They're not going to come into his school. Well, that forces the president's hand. Eisenhower, he's given lip service to civil rights, but he's done very little about it. Remember, Eisenhower's got problems with communism, and he's trying to kind of give us a peaceful America, trying to give us the good life, trying not to rock the boat too much and to push too hard on civil rights. Well, that's not really his main goal as president, but here he's going to have to make a choice because they're defying the federal government. It's his job to enforce federal law. And so Eisenhower doesn't mess around. He sends the 101st Airborne to Little Rock, and they're going to integrate that school. So no governor and some National Guard unit's going to keep them out. It's going to be integrated. And so the Little Rock Nine integrate this school, and you're going to see continual challenges from state to state. We're going to see challenges at Alabama when they try to integrate the colleges there. We're going to see them on a lot of local levels, but the federal government is starting to take a stand, at least in this area of schools. Now, as we move on into the 1960s, we continue to see civil rights demonstrations. Some of the remarkable demonstrations that happened in 1960, 4 young men in Greensboro, North Carolina, college students, they decide they're going to do their part. They're going to go to the Woolworth counter there, and they're going to sit down and demand to be served. And they're told, we don't serve you here. And so they sit, and the managers decide, well, let's not have them arrested. Let's just leave them there. They'll go home, and it'll end, and they'll be forgotten. But the next day, they brought back about 30 students, and they did it again. And again, day after day, they keep coming, and eventually it's crowds in the hundreds that are showing up, and you're starting to see crowds of people resisting, and occasionally there are people arrested because of incidents that take place, but ultimately they're going to force the Woolworth chain to eventually start to integrate. So, and you see it copied throughout the country at other locations where people start these sit-ins. And we'll see the sit-ins also used in other areas of protest as we get on into the 1960s, besides just civil rights. Now, a more mobile form of civil disobedience. In 1961, the Freedom Riders, both African American and white allies, joined together, and they're going to take buses from state to state. Now, they can't challenge local laws. Local laws can still, at this point, still be uphold segregation. But interstate commerce, which is regulated by the federal government, buses going from state to state, they're supposed to start to integrate. And so they're going to challenge the segregation that they're going to see at these bus stops and on these buses. And so they board buses, and they're going to go across the Deep South, and eventually their goal is to make it to New Orleans. But as soon as they cross over into Alabama, the local, few local officials who are resisting civil rights join with local Klan organizations, and they make sure that on that Sunday, the police are not going to show up when the bus is attacked by members of the local Klan. And the bus have their tires slashed at the bus stop. Their crippled bus tries to head on down the road. They're stopped. Eventually, they throw a firebomb into the bus where the Klansmen try to keep them inside to burn to death. Apparently, it was the initial plan, but then either a gas tank exploded or somebody in the group that was, pulled a gun, and for somebody that was in undercover with the Klan, or maybe a policeman pulled a gun and forced them to let the passengers out. Something forced them to let the passengers out. And at that point, then as soon as the passengers got off, they beat the passengers severely. Many passengers had to be hospitalized. But these freedom rides kept happening, putting pressure on the Kennedy administration with its national attention on them to finally try to broker a deal and to force integration. But it took this kind of action to make the federal government start to step up and do something. And of course, on the international, this was making international news by this point. This is one reason why the Kennedy administration is forced to act. It's not just our own country, but the communists are using this to make us look bad because of the segregation in our country. So we're starting to address it. The federal government's starting to address it. Finally, in 1963, we have the March on Washington, where thousands of civil rights demonstrators show up in Washington, D.C., and they have peaceful marches, and they have speeches at the Lincoln Memorial. And the most famous of those, of course, is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And so we're seeing people coming together demanding civil rights. And the government is starting to pay heed. Kennedy is moving towards a civil rights legislation. But of course, in November of 1963, we're going to see Kennedy assassinated. And that's going to lead to his successor, a Texan, Lyndon Johnson, take control. Now, Johnson, although he's a Texan, a Southerner, he had a history of having some sympathy towards civil rights. He also was a very able congressman, a senator for many years before he ever became the vice president. And when he becomes president, as we're going to see, he is one of our most able presidents at getting things done because he knew how to pressure people, he knew how to manipulate people, he knew how to get things through Congress, and he also has a martyr in Kennedy when he can say Kennedy wanted this Civil Rights Act to go through. Now that Kennedy is remembered more fondly because he is dead, people start to think, okay, this is Kennedy's legacy. So Johnson is able to get the 1964 Civil Rights Act through, which says that you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race, color, or sex. And that means in jobs, in pay, in education, and in voting rights. For years, African Americans had been denied their right to vote. And now this act says they should not be denied their right to vote. They should have equal access and opportunities to vote. However, even though this act said these things, it didn't really have enough teeth. It didn't have really any penalties or ways of enforcing, especially that vital thing, the voting rights. So the following year, Johnson pushes through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is going to allow the federal government to actually have some authority over what's going on in southern states. And to this day, states throughout the South have to pass government regulations that northern states don't have to pass whenever we redistrict and redistrict our voting districts. They have to have federal approval because we had been trying to use districting to prevent African Americans from having a voice. This law allows them to make sure African Americans are getting the opportunity and not being denied the right to vote. So this gave the federal government the ability to start enforcing voting rights. So by the mid-1960s, we have seen civil rights making progress. And there's been some federal laws now which are making it the law to end segregation. However, we're a long way from having everyone throughout the country accept this, both in their attitudes and also enforcing these laws locally. It's going to take years. And there's going to continue to be clashes and violence. And we're going to see the civil rights movement as we move into the later 60s become more radicalized. And we're going to see the pushback continue. But by 1965, we've seen major strides towards ending segregation.